Swann's Way by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief and Terence Kilmartin. Part 1. Cambrai. For a long time I would go to bed early. Sometimes, the candle barely out, my eyes closed so quickly that I did not have time to tell myself I'm falling asleep. And half an hour later, the thought that it was time to look for sleep would awaken me. I would make as if to put away the book which I imagined was still in my hands, and to blow out the light. I had gone on thinking, while I was asleep, about what I had just been reading, but these thoughts had taken a rather peculiar turn. It seemed to me that I myself was the immediate subject of my book. A church, a quartet, the rivalry between Francois I and Charles V. This impression would persist for some moments after I awoke. It did not offend my reason, but lay like scales upon my eyes and prevented them from registering the fact that the candle was no longer burning. Then it would begin to seem unintelligible, as the thoughts of a previous existence must be after reincarnation. The subject of my book would separate itself from me, leaving me free to apply myself to it or not. And at the same time my sight would return, and I would be astonished to find myself in a state of darkness, pleasant and restful enough for the eyes, but even more, perhaps, for my mind, to which it appeared incomprehensible, without a cause, something dark indeed. I would ask myself what time it could be. I could hear the whistling of trains, which, now nearer and now further off, punctuating the distance like the note of a bird in a forest, showed me in perspective the deserted countryside through which a traveler is hurrying towards the nearby station, and the path he is taking will be engraved in his memory by the excitement induced by strange surroundings, by unaccustomed activities, by the conversation he has had and the farewells exchanged beneath an unfamiliar lamp that still echo in his ears amid the silence of the night, and by the happy prospect of being home again. I would lay my cheeks gently against the comfortable cheeks of my pillow, as plump and fresh as the cheeks of childhood. I would strike a match to look at my watch. Nearly midnight. The hour when an invalid, who has been obliged to set out on a journey and to sleep in a strange hotel, awakened by a sudden spasm, sees with glad relief a streak of daylight showing under his door. Thank God it is morning. The servants will be about in a minute. He can ring, and someone will come to look after him. The thought of being assuaged gives him strength to endure his pain. He is certain he heard footsteps. They come nearer, and then die away. The ray of light beneath his door is extinguished. It is midnight. Someone has just turned down the gas. The last servant has gone to bed, and he must lie all night suffering without remedy. I would fall asleep again, and thereafter would reawaken for short snatches only, just long enough to hear the regular creaking of the wainscot, or to open my eyes to stare at the shifting kaleidoscope of the darkness, to savor, in a momentary glimmer of consciousness, the sleep which lay heavy upon the furniture, the room, that whole of which I formed no more than a small part, and whose insensibility I should very soon return to share. Or else, while sleeping, I had drifted back to an earlier stage in my life, now forever outgrown, and had come under the thrall of one of my childish terrors, such as that old terror of my great-uncle's pulling my curls, which was effectually dispelled on the day, the dawn of a new era to me, when they are finally cropped from my head. I had forgotten that event during my sleep, but I remembered it again immediately I had succeeded in waking myself up to escape my great-uncle's fingers, and as a measure of precaution, I would bury the whole of my head in the pillow before returning to the world of dreams. Sometimes, too, as Eve was created from a rib of Adam, a woman would be born during my sleep from some misplacing of my thigh. Conceived from the pleasure I was on the point of enjoying, she it was, I imagined, who offered me that pleasure. My body, conscious that its own warmth was permeating hers, would strive to become one with her, and I would awake. The rest of humanity seemed very remote in comparison with this woman whose company I had left but a moment ago. My cheek was still warm from her kiss. My body ached beneath the weight of hers. If, as would sometimes happen, she had the features of some woman whom I had known in waking hours, I would abandon myself altogether to this end, to find her again, like people who set out on a journey to see with their eyes some city of their desire, and imagine that one can taste in reality what has charmed one's fancy. And then, gradually, the memory of her would fade away. I had forgotten the girl of my dream. When a man is asleep, he has in a circle round him the chain of the hours, the sequence of the years, the order of the heavenly bodies. Instinctively, he consults them when he awakes, and in an instant reads off his own position on the earth's surface, in the time that has elapsed during his slumbers. But this ordered procession is apt to grow confused and to break its ranks. Suppose that, towards morning, after a night of insomnia, sleep descends upon him while he is reading, in quite a different position from that in which he normally goes to sleep. He has only to lift his arm to arrest the sun and turn it back in its course, and at the moment of waking, he will have no idea of the time, but will conclude that he has just gone to bed. Or suppose that he dozes off in some even more abnormal and divergent position, sitting in an armchair, for instance, after dinner. Then the world will go hurtling out of orbit. The magic chair will carry him at full speed through time and space. And when he opens his eyes again, he will imagine that he went to sleep months earlier, in another place. But for me, it was enough if, in my own bed, my sleep was so heavy as completely to relax my consciousness, for then I lost all sense of the place in which I had gone to sleep. And when I awoke in the middle of the night, not knowing where I was, I could not even be sure at first who I was. I had only the most rudimentary sense of existence, such as may lurk and flicker in the depths of an animal's consciousness. I was more destitute than the cave-dweller, but then the memory, not yet of the place in which I was, but of various other places where I had lived, and might now very possibly be, would come like a rope let down from heaven to draw me out of the abyss of not being, from which I could never have escaped by myself. In a flash, I would traverse centuries of civilization, and out of a blurred glimpse of oil lamps, then of shirts with turned-down collars, would gradually piece together the original components of my ego. Perhaps the immobility of the things that surround us is forced upon them by our conviction that they are themselves and not anything else, by the immobility of our conception of them. For it always happened that when I awoke like this, and my mind struggled in an unsuccessful attempt to discover where I was, everything revolved around me through the darkness. Things, places, years. My body, still too heavy with sleep to move, would endeavor to construe from the pattern of its tiredness the position of its various limbs, in order to deduce therefrom the direction of the wall, the location of the furniture, to piece together and give a name to the house in which it lay. Its memory, the composite memory of its ribs, its knees, its shoulder blades, offered it a series of rooms in which it had at one time or another slept, while the unseen walls, shifting and adapting themselves to the shape of each successive room that it remembered, whirled round in the dark. And even before my brain, hesitating at the threshold of times and shapes, had reassembled the circumstances sufficiently to identify the room, it, my body, would recall from each room in succession the style of the bed, the position of the doors, the angle at which the daylight came in at the windows, whether there was a passage outside, what I had had in my mind when I went to sleep and found there when I awoke. The stiffened side on which I lay would, for instance, in trying to fix its position, imagine itself to be lying face to the wall in a big bed with a canopy. And at once I would say to myself, "Why, I must have fallen asleep before Mama came to say good night." For I was in the country at my grandfather's, who died years ago, and my body, the side upon which I was lying, faithful guardians of a past which my mind should never have forgotten, brought back before my eyes the glimmering flame of the night light in its urn-shaped bowl of Bohemian glass that hung by chains from the ceiling, and the chimney-piece of sienna marble in my bedroom at Cambrai, in my grandparents' house, in those far-distant days which at this moment I imagine to be in the present without being able to picture them exactly, and which would become plainer in a little while, when I was properly awake. Then the memory of a new position would spring up, and the wall would slide away in another direction. I was in my room in Madame de Saint-Loux's house in the country. Good heavens, it must be 10 o'clock. They will have finished dinner. I must have overslept myself in the little nap which I always take when I come in for my walk with Madame de Saint-Loux, before dressing for the evening. For many years have now elapsed since the Cambrai days when, coming in from the longest and latest walks, I would still be in time to see the reflection of the sunset glowing in the panes of my bedroom window. It is a very different kind of life that one leads at Tansonville, at Madame de Saint-Loux's, and a different kind of pleasure that I derive from taking walks only in the evenings, from visiting by moonlight the roads on which I used to play as a child in the sunshine. As for the bedroom in which I must have fallen asleep instead of dressing for dinner, I can see it from the distance as we return from our walk, with its lamp shining through the window, a solitary beacon in the night. These shifting and confused gusts of memory never lasted for more than a few seconds. It often happened that, in my brief spell of uncertainty as to where I was, I did not distinguish the various suppositions of which it was composed any more than, when we watch a horse running, we isolate the successive positions of its body as they appear upon a bioscope. But I had seen first one and then another of the rooms in which I had slept during my life, and in the end I would revisit them all in the long course of my waking dream. Rooms in winter, where on going to bed I would at once bury my head in a nest woven out of the most diverse materials, the corner of my pillow, the top of my blankets, a piece of a shawl, the edge of my bed, and a copy of a children's paper, which I had contrived to cement together, bird fashion, by dint of continuous pressure. Rooms where, in freezing weather, I would enjoy the satisfaction of being shut in from the outer world, like the sea swallow, which builds at the end of a dark tunnel and is kept warm by the surrounding earth, and where, the fire keeping in all night, I would sleep wrapped up, as it were, in a great cloak of snug and smoky air, shot with the glow of the logs intermittently breaking out again in flame. A sort of alcove without walls, a cave of warmth, dug out of the heart of the room itself, a zone of heat whose boundaries were constantly shifting and altering in temperature as gusts of air traversed them to strike freshly upon my face from the corners of the room, or from parts near the window, or far from the fireplace, which had therefore remained cold. Or rooms in summer, where I would delight to feel myself a part of the warm night, where the moonlight striking upon the half-opened shutters would throw down to the foot of my bed its enchanted ladder, where I would fall asleep, as it might be in the open air, like a titmouse which the breeze gently rocks at the tip of a sunbeam. Or sometimes the Louis XVI room, so cheerful that I never felt too miserable in it, even on my first night, and in which the slender columns that lightly supported its ceiling drew so gracefully apart to reveal and frame the sight of the bed. Sometimes again, the little room with the high ceiling, hollowed in the form of a pyramid out of 2 separate stories, and partly walled with mahogany, in which from the first moment, mentally poisoned by the unfamiliar scent of vetiver, I was convinced of the hostility of the violet curtains and of the insolent indifference of a clock that chattered on at the top of its voice as though I were not there, in which a strange and pitiless rectangular cheval glass, standing across one corner of the room, carved out for itself a site I had not looked to find tenanted in the soft plenitude of my normal field of vision, in which my mind, striving for hours on end to break away from its moorings, to stretch upwards so as to take on the exact shape of the room, and to reach to the topmost height of its gigantic funnel, had endured many a painful sight as I lay stretched out in bed, my eyes staring upwards, my ears straining, my nostrils flaring, my heart beating, until habit had changed the color of the curtains, silenced the clock, brought an expression of pity to the cruel, slanting face of the glass, disguised, or even completely dispelled the scent of vetiver, and appreciably reduced the apparent loftiness of the ceiling. Habit, that skillful but slow-moving arranger, who begins by letting our minds suffer for weeks on end in temporary quarters, but whom our minds are none the less only too happy to discover at last, for without it, reduced to their own devices, they would be powerless to make any room seem habitable. Certainly I was now well awake. My body had veered round for the last time, and the good angel of certainty had made all the surrounding objects stand still, had set me down under my bedclothes, in my bedroom, and had fixed, approximately in their right places in the uncertain light, my chest of drawers, my writing table, my fireplace, the window overlooking the street, and both the doors. But for all that I now knew that I was not in any of the houses of which the ignorance of the waking moment had, in a flash, if not presented me with a distinct picture, at least persuaded me of the possible presence, my memory had been set in motion. As a rule, I did not attempt to go to sleep again at once, but used to spend the greater part of the night recalling our life in the old days at Cambrai, with my great-aunt, at Baalbec, Paris, Doncier, Venice, and the rest, remembering again all the places and people I had known, what I had actually seen of them, and what others had told me. At Cambrai, as every afternoon ended, long before the time when I should have gone to bed and lie there, unsleeping, far from my mother and grandmother, my bedroom became the fixed point on which my melancholy and anxious thoughts were centered. Someone had indeed had the happy idea of giving me, to distract me on evenings when I seemed abnormally wretched, a magic lantern, which used to be set on top of my lamp while we waited for dinner time to come, and, after the fashion of the master builders and glass painters of Gothic days, it substituted for the opaqueness of my walls an impalpable iridescence, supernatural phenomena of many colors, in which legends were depicted as on a shifting and transitory window. But my sorrows were only increased thereby, because this mere change of lighting was enough to destroy the familiar impression I had of my room, thanks to which, save for the torture of going to bed, it had become quite endurable. Now I no longer recognized it, and felt uneasy in it, as in a room in some hotel or chalet, in a place where I had just arrived by train for the first time. Riding at a jerky trot, Golo, filled with an infamous design, issued from the little triangular forest which softened with dark green the slope of a hill, and advanced fitfully towards the castle of poor Geneviève de Brabant. This castle was cut off short by a curved line, which was in fact the circumference of one of the transparent ovals in the slides, which were pushed into position through a slot in the lantern. It was only the wing of a castle, and in front of it stretched a moor on which Geneviève stood dreaming, wearing a blue girdle. The castle and the moor were yellow, but I could tell their color without waiting to see them, for before the slides made their appearance, the old gold sonorous name of Brabant had given me an unmistakable clue. Golo stopped for a moment and listened sadly to the accompanying patter read aloud by my great-aunt, which he seemed perfectly to understand, for he modified his attitude with a docility not devoid of a degree of majesty, so as to conform to the indications given in the text. Then he rode away at the same jerky trot, and nothing could arrest his slow progress. If the lantern were moved, I could still distinguish Golo's horse advancing across the window curtains, swelling out with their curves and diving into their folds. The body of Golo himself, being of the same supernatural substance as his steeds, overcame every material obstacle, everything that seemed to bar his way, by taking it as an ossature and absorbing it into himself. Even the doorknob, on which, adapting themselves at once, his red cloak or his pale face, still as noble and as melancholy, floated invincibly, would never betray the least concern at this transvertebration. And, indeed, I found plenty of charm in these bright projections, which seemed to emanate from a Merovingian past and shed around me the reflections of such ancient history. But I cannot express the discomfort I felt at this intrusion of mystery and beauty into a room which I had succeeded in filling with my own personality until I thought no more of it than of myself. The anesthetic effect of habit being destroyed, I would begin to think and to feel such melancholy things. The doorknob of my room, which was different to me from all the other doorknobs in the world, inasmuch as it seemed to move of its own accord, and without my having to turn it, so unconscious had its manipulation become. Lo and behold, it was now an astral body for Golo. And as soon as the dinner bell rang, I would hurry down to the dining room, where the big hanging lamp, ignorant of Golo and Bluebeard, but well acquainted with my family and the dish of stewed beef, shed the same light as on every other evening, and I would fall into the arms of my mother, whom the misfortunes of Genevieve de Brabant had made all the dearer to me, just as the crimes of Golo had driven me to a more than ordinarily scrupulous examination of my own conscience. But after dinner, alas, I was soon obliged to leave Mamma, who stayed talking with the others, in the garden if it was fine, or in the little parlor where everyone took shelter when it was wet. Everyone except my grandmother, who held that it's a pity to shut oneself indoors in the country, and used to have endless arguments with my father on the very wettest days, because he would send me up to my room with a book instead of letting me stay out of doors. "That is not the way to make him strong and active," she would say sadly, "especially this little man, who needs all the strength and willpower that he can get." My father would shrug his shoulders and study the barometer, for he took an interest in meteorology, while my mother, keeping very quiet so as not to disturb him, looked at him with tender respect, but not too hard, not wishing to penetrate the mysteries of his superior mind. But my grandmother, in all weathers, even when the rain was coming down in torrents, and Francois had rushed the precious wicker armchairs indoors so that they should not get soaked, was to be seen pacing the deserted rain-lashed garden, pushing back her disordered gray locks, so that her forehead might be freer to absorb the health-giving draughts of wind and rain. She would say, "At last, one can breathe," and would trot up and down the sodden paths, too straight and symmetrical for her liking, owing to the want of any feeling for nature in the new gardener, whom my father had been asking all morning if the weather were going to improve. Her keen, jerky little step, regulated by the various effects wrought upon her soul by the intoxication of the storm, the power of hygiene, the stupidity of my upbringing, and the symmetry of gardens, rather than by any anxiety, for that was quite unknown to her, to save her plum-colored skirt from the mud-stains beneath which it would gradually disappear to a height that was the constant bane and despair of her maid. When these walks of my grandmother's took place after dinner, there was one thing which never failed to bring her back to the house. This was if, at one of those points when her circular itinerary brought her back, moth-like, in sight of the lamp in the little parlor, where the liqueurs were set out on the card table, my great-aunt called out to her, "Bathilda, come in and stop your husband drinking brandy." For, simply to tease her, she had brought so different a type of mind into my father's family that everyone made fun of her. My great-aunt used to make my grandfather, who was forbidden liqueurs, take just a few drops. My poor grandmother would come in and beg and implore her husband not to taste the brandy, and he would get angry and gulp it down all the same, and she would go out again sad and discouraged, but still smiling, for she was so humble of heart and so gentle, that her tenderness for others and her disregard for herself and her own troubles blended in a smile which, unlike those seen on the majority of human faces, bore no trace of irony save for herself, while for all of us kisses seemed to spring from her eyes, which could not look upon those she loved without seeming to bestow upon them passionate caresses. This torture, inflicted on her by my great-aunt, the sight of my grandmother's vain entreaties, of her feeble attempts, doomed in advance, to remove the liqueur glass from my grandfather's hands, all these things were of the sort to which, in later years, one can grow so accustomed as to smile at them and to take the persecutor's side resolutely and cheerfully enough, to persuade oneself that it is not really persecution. But in those days, they filled me with such horror that I longed to strike my great-aunt. And yet, as soon as I heard her, "Bathilda, come in and stop your husband drinking brandy," in my cowardice I became at once a man, and did what all we grown men do when face to face with suffering and injustice. I preferred not to see them. I ran up to the top of the house to cry by myself, in a little room beside the schoolroom and beneath the roof, which smelt of orris root, and was scented also by a wild currant bush, which had climbed up between the stones of the outer wall and thrust a flowering branch in through the half-open window. Intended for a more special and a baser use, this room, from which, in the daytime, I could see as far as the keep of Roussainville-les-Pins, was for a long time my place of refuge, doubtless because it was the only room whose door I was allowed to lock whenever my occupation was such as required an inviolable solitude, reading or daydreaming, tears or sensual pleasure. Alas, I did not realize that my own lack of willpower, my delicate health, and the consequent uncertainty as to my future weighed far more heavily on my grandmother's mind than any little dietary indiscretion by her husband in the course of those endless perambulations, afternoon and evening, during which we used to see her handsome face passing to and fro, half raised towards the sky, its brown and wrinkled cheeks, which with age had acquired almost the purple hue of tilled fields in autumn, covered, if she were going out, by a half-lifted veil, while upon them either the cold or some sad reflection invariably left the drying traces of an involuntary tear. My sole consolation when I went upstairs for the night was that Mamma would come in and kiss me after I was in bed. But this good night lasted for so short a time, she went down again so soon, that the moment in which I heard her climb the stairs, and then caught the sound of her garden dress of blue muslin, from which hung little tassels of plaited straw, rustling along the double-doored corridor, was for me a moment of the utmost pain, for it heralded the moment which was to follow it, when she would have left me and gone downstairs again. So much so that I reached the point of hoping that this good night, which I loved so much, would come as late as possible, so as to prolong the time of respite during which Mamma would not yet have appeared. Sometimes when, after kissing me, she opened the door to go, I longed to call her back, to say to her, "Kiss me just once more," but I knew that then she would at once look displeased, for the concession which she made to my wretchedness and agitation in coming up to give me this kiss of peace always annoyed my father, who thought such rituals absurd, and she would have liked to try to induce me to outgrow the need, the habit, of having her there at all, let alone get into the habit of asking her for an additional kiss when she was already crossing the threshold. And to see her look displeased destroyed all the calm and serenity she had brought me a moment before, when she had bent her loving face down over my bed, and held it out to me like a host for an act of peace-giving communion in which my lips might imbibe her real presence, and with it, the power to sleep. But those evenings on which Mamma stayed so short a time in my room were sweet indeed compared to those at which we had people to dinner, and therefore she did not come at all. Our people were usually limited to Monsieur Swann, who, apart from a few passing strangers, was almost the only person who ever came to the house at Cambrai, sometimes to a neighborly dinner, but less frequently since his unfortunate marriage, as my family did not care to receive his wife, and sometimes after dinner, uninvited. On those evenings when, as we sat in front of the house, round the iron table beneath the big chestnut tree, we heard, from the far end of the garden, not the shrill and assertive alarm bell which assailed and deafened with its ferruginous, interminable, frozen sound any member of the household who set it off on entering without ringing, But the double tinkle, timid, oval, golden, of the visitor's bell, everyone would at once exclaim, "A visitor! Who in the world can it be?" But they knew quite well that it could only be Monsieur Swann. My great-aunt, speaking in a loud voice to set an example, in a tone which she endeavored to make sound natural, would tell the others not to whisper so, that nothing could be more offensive to a stranger coming in, who would be led to think that people were saying things about him which he was not meant to hear. And then my grandmother, always happy to find an excuse for an additional turn in the garden, would be sent out to reconnoiter, and would take the opportunity to remove surreptitiously, as she passed, the stakes of a rose tree or two, so as to make the roses look a little more natural, as a mother might run her hand through her boy's hair after the barber has smoothed it down, to make it look naturally wavy. We would all wait there in suspense for the report which my grandmother would bring back from the enemy lines, as though there might be a choice between a large number of possible assailants, and then, soon after, my grandfather would say, "I recognize Swann's voice." And indeed, one could tell him only by his voice, for it was difficult to make out his face, with its arched nose and green eyes, under a high forehead fringed with fair, almost red hair, done in the Bresson style, because in the garden we used as little light as possible, so as not to attract mosquitoes, and I would slip away unobtrusively to order the liqueurs to be brought out, for my grandmother made a great point, thinking it nicer of their not being allowed to seem anything out of the ordinary, which we kept for visitors only. Although a far younger man, Monsieur Swann was very attached to my grandfather, who had been an intimate friend of Swann's father, an excellent but eccentric man, the ardor of whose feelings and the current of whose thoughts would often be checked or diverted by the most trifling thing. Several times in the course of the year, I would hear my grandfather tell at table the story, which never varied, of the behavior of Monsieur Swann the elder upon the death of his wife, by whose bedside he had watched day and night. My grandfather, who had not seen him for a long time, hastened to join him at the Swann's family property on the outskirts of Cambrai, and managed to entice him for a moment, weeping profusely, out of the death chamber, so that he should not be present when the body was laid in its coffin. They took a turn or two in the park, where there was a little sunshine. Suddenly Monsieur Swann seized my grandfather by the arm and cried, "Ah, my dear old friend, how fortunate we are to be walking here together on such a charming day. Don't you see how pretty they are, all these trees, my hawthorns, and my new pond, on which you have never congratulated me? You look as solemn as the grave. Don't you feel this little breeze? Ah, whatever you may say, it's good to be alive and all the same, my dear Amadea." And then, abruptly, the memory of his dead wife returned to him, and probably thinking it too complicated to inquire into how, at such a time, he could have allowed himself to be carried away by an impulse of happiness, he confined himself to a gesture which he habitually employed whenever any perplexing question came into his mind. That is, he passed his hand across his forehead, rubbed his eyes, and wiped his glasses. And yet he never got over the loss of his wife, but used to say to my grandfather, during the 2 years by which he survived her, "It's a funny thing now. I very often think of my poor wife, but I cannot think of her for long at a time." Often, but a little at a time, like poor old Swann, became one of my grandfather's favorite sayings, which he would apply to all manner of things. I should have assumed that his father of Swann's had been a monster if my grandfather, whom I regarded as a better judge than myself, and whose word was my law, and often led me in the long run to pardon offenses which I should have been inclined to condemn, had not gone on to exclaim, "But after all, he had a heart of gold." For many years, during the course of which, especially before his marriage, Monsieur Swann the younger came often to see them at Cambrai, my great-aunt and my grandparents never suspected that he had entirely ceased to live in this society which his family had frequented, and that, under the sort of incognito which the name of Swann gave him among us, they were harboring, with the complete innocence of a family of respectable innkeepers, who have in their midst some celebrated wayman without knowing it, one of the most distinguished members of the Jockey Club, a particular friend of the Comte de Paris and of the Prince of Wales, and one of the men most sought after in the aristocratic world of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Our utter ignorance of the brilliant social life which Swann led was, of course, due in part to his own reserve and discretion, but also to the fact that middle-class people in those days took what was almost a Hindu view of society, which they held to consist of sharply defined castes, so that everyone at his birth found himself called to that station in life which his parents already occupied, and from which nothing, save the accident of an exceptional career or of a good marriage, could extract you and translate you to a superior caste. Monsieur Swann the elder had been a stockbroker, and so young Swann found himself immured for life in a caste whose members' fortunes, as in a category of taxpayers, varied between such and such limits of income. One knew the people with whom his father had associated, and so one knew his own associates, the people with whom he was in a position to mix. If he knew other people besides, those were youthful acquaintances on whom the old friends of his family, like my relatives, shut their eyes all the more good-naturedly, because Swann himself, after he was left an orphan, still came most faithfully to see us. But we would have been ready to wager that the people outside our acquaintance, whom Swann knew, were of the sort to whom he would not have dared to raise his hat if he had met them while he was walking with us. Had it been absolutely essential to apply to Swann a social coefficient peculiar to himself, as distinct from all the other sons of other stockbrokers in his father's position, his coefficient would have been rather lower than theirs, because, being very simple in his habits, and having always had a craze for antiques and pictures, he now lived and amassed his collections in an old house, which my grandmother longed to visit, but which was situated on the Quai des Orleans, a neighborhood in which my great-aunt thought it most degrading to be quartered. "Are you really a connoisseur, at least?" she would say to him. "I ask for your own sake, as you are likely to have fakes palmed off on you by the dealers," for she did not, in fact, endow him with any critical faculty, and had no great opinion of the intelligence of a man who, in conversation, would avoid serious topics and showed a very dull preciseness, not only when he gave us kitchen recipes, going into the most minute details, but even when my grandmother's sisters were talking to him about art. When challenged by them to give an opinion, or to express his admiration for some picture, he would remain almost disobligingly silent, and would then make amends by furnishing, if he could, some fact or other about the gallery in which the picture was hung, or the date at which it had been painted. But as a rule, he would content himself with trying to amuse us by telling us about his latest adventure with someone whom we ourselves knew, such as the Cambrai chemist, or our cook, or our coachman. These stories certainly used to make my great-aunt laugh, but she could never decide whether this was on account of the absurd role which Swann invariably gave himself therein, or of the wit that he showed in telling them. "I must say, you really are a regular character, Monsieur Swann." As she was the only member of our family who could be described as a trifle common, she would always take care to remark to strangers, when Swann was mentioned, that he could easily, had he so wished, have lived in the Boulevard Haussmann or the Avenue de l'Opéra, and that he was the son of old Monsieur Swann, who must have left 4 or 5 million francs, but that it was a fad of his, a fad which, moreover, she thought was bound to amuse other people so much that in Paris, when Monsieur Swann called on New Year's Day, bringing her a little packet of moments glacés, she never failed, if there were strangers in the room, to say to him, "Well, Monsieur Swann, and do you still live next door to the bonded warehouse, so as to be sure of not missing your train when you go to Lyon?" And she would peep out of the corner of her eye, over her glasses, at the other visitors. But if anyone had suggested to my great-aunt that this Swann, who, in his capacity as the son of old Monsieur Swann, was fully qualified to be received by any of the best people, by the most respected barristers and solicitors of Paris, though he was perhaps a trifle inclined to let this hereditary privilege go by default, had another almost secret existence of a wholly different kind, that when he left our house in Paris, saying that he must go home to bed, he would no sooner have turned the corner than he would stop, retrace his steps, and be off to some salon on whose like no stockbroker or associate of stockbrokers have ever set eyes. That would have seemed to my aunt as extraordinary as, to a woman of wider reading, the thought of being herself on terms of intimacy with Aristeas, and of learning that after having a chat with her, he would plunge deep into the realms of Thetis, into an empire veiled from mortal eyes, in which Virgil depicts him as being received with open arms, or to be content with an image more likely to have occurred to her, for she had it painted on the plates we used for biscuits at Cambrai, as the thought of having had to dinner Ali Baba, who, as soon as he finds himself alone and unobserved, will make his way into the cave, resplendent with its unsuspected treasures. One day, when he had come to see us after dinner in Paris, apologizing for being in evening clothes, Francois told us after he had left that she had got it from his coachman that he had been dining with a princess. "A nice sort of princess," retorted my aunt, shrugging her shoulders without raising her eyes from her knitting, serenely sarcastic. Altogether, my great-aunt treated him with scant ceremony. Since she was of the opinion that he ought to feel flattered by our invitations, she thought it only right and proper that he should never come to see us in summer without a basket of peaches or raspberries from his garden, and that from each of his visits to Italy he should bring back some photographs of old masters for me. It seemed quite natural, therefore, to send for him whenever a recipe for some special sauce, or for a pineapple salad was needed for one of our big dinner parties, to which he himself would not be invited, being regarded as insufficiently important to be served up to new friends who might be in our house for the first time. If the conversation turned upon the princes of the House of France, "Gentlemen, you and I will never know, will we? And don't want to, do we?" my great-aunt would say tartly to Swann, who had, perhaps, a letter from Twickenham in his pocket. She would make him push the piano into place and turn over the music on evenings when my grandmother's sister sang, manipulating this person who was elsewhere so sought after with the rough simplicity of a child, who will play with a collector's piece with no more circumspection than if it were a cheap gewgaw. Doubtless, the Swann who was a familiar figure in all the clubs of those days differed hugely from the Swann created by my great-aunt when, of an evening, in our little garden at Cambrai, after the 2 shy peals had sounded from the gate, she would inject and vitalize with everything she knew about the Swann family the obscure and shadowy figure who emerged, with my grandmother in his wake, from the dark background and who is identified by his voice. But then, even in the most insignificant details of our daily life, none of us can be said to constitute a material whole, which is identical for everyone, and need only be turned up like a page in an account book, or the record of a will. Our social personality is a creation of the thoughts of other people. Even the simple act which we describe as seeing someone we know is to some extent an intellectual process. We pack the physical outline of the person we see with all the notions we have already formed about him. And in the total picture of him which we compose in our minds, those notions have certainly the principal place. In the end, they come to fill out so completely the curve of his cheeks, to follow so exactly the line of his nose. They blend so harmoniously in the sound of his voice, as if it were no more than a transparent envelope, that each time we see the face or hear the voice, it is these notions which we recognize and to which we listen. And so, no doubt, from the Swann they had constructed for themselves, my family had left out, in their ignorance, a whole host of details of his life in the world of fashion, details which caused other people, when they met him, to see all the graces enthroned in his face, and stopping at the line of his aquiline nose, as at a natural frontier. But they had contrived also to put into this face, divested of all glamour, vacant and roomy as an untenanted house, to plant in the depths of these undervalued eyes a lingering residuum, vague but not unpleasing, half memory and half oblivion, of idle hours spent together after our weekly dinners, round the card table, or in the garden, during our companionable country life. Our friend's corporeal envelope had been so well lined with this residuum, as well as various earlier memories of his parents, that their own special Swann had become to my family a complete and living creature, so that even now I have the feeling of leaving someone I know for another quite different person when, going back in memory, I pass from the Swann whom I knew later and more intimately to this early Swann in whom I can distinguish the charming mistakes of my youth, and who, in fact, is less like his successor than he is like the other people I knew at that time, as though one's life were a picture gallery in which all the portraits of any one period had a marked family likeness, a similar tonality. This early Swann abounding in leisure, fragrant with the scent of the great chestnut tree, of baskets of raspberries, and of a sprig of tarragon. And yet one day, when my grandmother had gone to ask some favor of a lady whom she had known at the Sacré-Cœur, and with whom, because of our notions of caste, she had not cared to keep up any degree of intimacy in spite of several common interests, the Marquise de Villeparisis of the famous house of Bouillon, this lady had said to her, "I believe you know Monsieur Swann very well. He's a great friend of my nephew and niece, La Delhomme." My grandmother had returned from the call, full of praise for the house, which overlooked some gardens, and in which Madame de Villeparisis had advised her to rent a flat, and also for a repairing tailor and his daughter, who kept a little shop in the courtyard, into which she had gone to ask them to put a stitch in her skirt, which she had torn on the staircase. My grandmother had found these people perfectly charming. The girl, she said, was a jewel, and the tailor the best and most distinguished man she had ever seen. For in her eyes, distinction was a thing wholly independent of social position. She was in ecstasies over some answer the tailor had made to her, saying to Mamma, "Sévigné would not have put it better." And, by way of contrast, of a nephew of Madame de Villeparisis whom she had met at the house, "My dear, he is so common." Now, The effect of the remark about Swann had been not to raise him in my great-aunt's estimation, but to lower Madame de Villeparisis. It appeared that the deference which, on my grandmother's authority, we owed to Madame de Villeparisis imposed on her the reciprocal obligation to do nothing that would render her less worthy of our regard, and that she had failed in this duty by becoming aware of Swann's existence, and in allowing members of her family to associate with him. What? She knows Swann? A person who, you always made out, was related to Marshal MacMahon? This view of Swann's social position which prevailed in my family seemed to be confirmed later on by his marriage with a woman of the worst type, almost a prostitute, whom, to do him justice, he never attempted to introduce to us, for he continued to come to our house alone, though more and more seldom, but from whom they felt they could establish, on the assumption that he had found her there, the circle, unknown to them, in which he ordinarily moved. But on one occasion, my grandfather read in a newspaper that Monsieur Swann was one of the most regular attendants at the Sunday luncheons given by the Duc d'Aix, whose father and uncle had been among our most prominent statesmen in the reign of Louis Philippe. Now, my grandfather was curious to learn all the smallest details which might help him to take a mental share in the private lives of men like Molé, the Duc Pasquier, or the Duc de Broglie. He was delighted to find that Swann associated with people who had known them. My great-aunt, on the other hand, interpreted this piece of news in a sense discreditable to Swann. For anyone who chose his associates outside the caste in which he had been born and bred, outside his proper station, automatically lowered himself in her eyes. It seemed to her that such a one abdicated all claim to enjoy the fruits of the splendid connections with people of good position, which prudent parents cultivate and store up for their children's benefit, and she had actually ceased to see the son of a lawyer of our acquaintance because he had married a highness, and had thereby stepped down, in her eyes, from the respectable position of a lawyer's son to that of those adventurers, upstart footmen of stable boys mostly, to whom, we are told, queens have sometimes shown their favors. She objected, therefore, to my grandfather's plan of questioning Swann. When next he came to dine with us, about these people whose friendship with him we had discovered. At the same time, my grandmother's two sisters, elderly spinsters who shared her nobility of character, but lacked her intelligence, declared that they could not conceive what pleasure their brother-in-law could find in talking about such trifles. They were ladies of lofty aspirations, who, for that reason, were incapable of taking the least interest in what might be termed gossip, even if it had some historical import, or, generally speaking, in anything that was not directly associated with some aesthetic or virtuous object. So complete was their negation of interest in anything which seemed directly or indirectly connected with worldly matters, that their sense of hearing, having finally come to realize its temporary futility when the tone of the conversation at the dinner table became frivolous or merely mundane without the two old ladies being able to guide it back to topics dear to themselves, would put its receptive organs into abeyance to the point of actually becoming atrophied, so that, if my grandfather wished to attract the attention of the two sisters, he had to resort to some such physical stimuli as alienists adopt in dealing with their distracted patients, to wit, repeated taps on a glass with the blade of a knife, accompanied by a sharp word and a compelling glance. Violent methods, which these psychiatrists are apt to bring with them into their daily life among the sane, either from force, a professional habit, or because they think the whole world a trifle mad. Their interest grew, however, when, the day before Swann was to dine with us, and when he had made them a special present of a case of asti, my great-aunt, who had in her hand a copy of the Figaro, in which to the name of a picture then on view in a co-wrought exhibition were added the words, "From the collection of Monsieur Charles Swann," asked, "Did you see that Swann is mentioned in the Figaro?" "But I've always told you," said my grandmother, "that he had a great deal of taste." "You would, of course," retorted my great-aunt, "say anything just to seem different from us." For, knowing that my grandmother never agreed with her, and not being quite confident that it was her own opinion which the rest of us invariably endorsed, she wished to extort from us a wholesale condemnation of my grandmother's views, against which she hoped to force us into solidarity with her own. But we sat silent. My grandmother's sisters having expressed a desire to mention to Swann this reference to him in the Figaro, my great-aunt dissuaded them. Whenever she saw in others an advantage, however trivial, which she herself lacked, she would persuade herself that it was no advantage at all, but a drawback, and would pity so as not to have to envy them. I don't think that would please him at all. I know very well that I should hate to see my name printed like that, as large as life, in the paper, and I shouldn't feel at all flattered if anyone spoke to me about it. She did not, however, put any very great pressure upon my grandmother's sisters, for they, in their horror of vulgarity, had brought to such a fine art the concealment of a personal allusion in a wealth of ingenious circumlocution, that it would often pass unnoticed even by the person to whom it was addressed. As for my mother, her only thought was of trying to induce my father to speak to Swann, not about his wife, but about his daughter, whom he worshipped, and for whose sake it was understood that he had ultimately made his unfortunate marriage. "You need only say a word. Just ask him how she is. It must be so very hard for him." My father, however, was annoyed. No, you have the most absurd ideas. It would be utterly ridiculous." But the only one of us in whom the prospect of Swann's arrival gave rise to an unhappy foreboding was myself. This was because on the evenings when there were visitors, or just Monsieur Swann, in the house, Mamma did not come up to my room. I dined before the others, and afterwards came and sat at table until 8 o'clock, when it was understood that I must go upstairs. That frail and precious kiss, which Mamma used normally to bestow on me when I was in bed and just going to sleep, had to be transported from the dining room to my bedroom, where I must keep it inviolate all the time that it took me to undress, without letting its sweet charm be broken, without letting its volatile essence diffuse itself and evaporate. And it was precisely on those very evenings, when I needed to receive it with special care, that I was obliged to take it, to snatch it brusquely and in public, without even having the time or the equanimity to bring to what I was doing the single-minded attention of lunatics, who would compel themselves to exclude all other thoughts while they were shutting a door, so that, when the sickness of uncertainty sweeps over them again, they can triumphantly oppose it with the recollection of the precise moment when they shut the door.